Welcome to United States History 2. This is Week 5, Removing the Rust, World War II. Germany after World War I was really a mess economically. The Versailles Treaty, if you recall, had demanded war reparations of Germany. It was a treaty that was both vindictive and punitive. In Germany, the Weimar Republic was established in 1919. And it largely proved unable to handle the war reparations, and the economy of Germany collapsed. In 1914, for instance, the exchange rate of the German mark to the US dollar was 4.2 to 1. That meant for every US dollar was worth 4.2 marks. By November of 1923, and this is not an exaggeration, this is an example of the super, or what they call hyperinflation, that was occurring in Germany, was doing to the economy. The exchange rate, again, not an exaggeration, of the German mark to the US dollar was 4.2 trillion to 1. That is, every one US dollar was worth 4.2 trillion marks. So literally, people were taking wheelbarrows of German marks, that is the German currency, to buy loaves of bread and just the basics. The German currency was worth really nothing. A Great Depression began in the United States in 1929, and it spread worldwide and helped to fuel totalitarianism. Totalitarianism, really, when we think of that, we think of fanaticism. We think of very radical ideological beliefs. That if we were to define totalitarian, we would say a totalitarian state is one that's politically and economically highly centralized, very anti-liberal, highly controlling, and invasive in its attitude towards its own citizens, as well as being militaristic. And that's kind of adapted from the Oxford Companion to Politics. It differed from absolutism or authoritarianism that we sometimes say, like, oh, Peter the Great's Russia was absolutist or authoritarian. Those states that were absolutist or authoritarian had neither the ability nor the desire to control many aspects of their subjects' lives, whereas totalitarian was really very controlling of their subjects' lives, their citizens' lives, very invasive in their lives. And all of this was the complete antithesis of classical liberalism, which sought to limit the power of the state and to protect the almost sacred rights of the individual. It was what the Enlightenment was all about. Classic liberalism was what the Enlightenment was all about. Classic liberalism was what the United States and the founding fathers and its Constitution were all about. Liberalism in the sense of freedom, and the freedom for individuals to do what they wanted. Well, the Soviet Union was experiencing its own totalitarianism under Lenin, who died in 1924, and then later on under Joseph Stalin, who pursued collectivization of agriculture. That is, taking away land from the peasants in Russia. Well, of course, it was now the communist Soviet Union, taking away land from the peasants and making big collective farms where the peasants would work on state-owned land and farms. And the peasants really fought this whole thing, and they were not happy. As many as 10 million people died in Russia, in the Soviet Union, because of the forced collectivization of agriculture. And then Stalin also went about arresting those who did not agree with him, sending them to prisons or to work camps. At least 8 million were arrested, and of these, millions were executed or died in prisons or work camps. So we don't think of Joseph Stalin, who later on becomes kind of our ally, and not kind of, is our ally in World War II. And people say Uncle Joe Stalin. He was really a dictator and a man who pursued very totalitarian measures. And we know that this idea of totalitarianism expressed itself more particularly in what is called fascism. Fascism included Hitler's Nazi Germany, Mussolini's Italy, Franco's Spain. So all three of these, Germany, Italy, and Spain, were fascist regimes. They were totalitarian regimes. And fascism can perhaps best be described as everything in the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. That's what Benito Mussolini described it as in 1922 when he seized power in Italy. Italy never became quite the totalitarian state in the same sense as the Soviet Union or Germany did. However, it was indeed a fascist state. And then meanwhile, over in Asia, Japan was becoming very militaristic, very imperialistic, and invaded Manchuria in 1931, which was a part of China. China at this time was literally kind of falling apart into pieces. And then, of course, you all know that in 1933, Hitler came to power in Germany, and he was in charge of the Nazi Party. Hitler blamed World War I on Jewish bankers and businessmen, and so he fueled already an anti-Semitism that was present among the German people and that had existed really for centuries. And of course, he declares the Third Reich. Reich means reign or empire, rule. The First Reich was the Holy Roman Empire, the Second Reich, Bismarck's Germany, and the Third Reich was Hitler's Germany. Well, in 1935, Mussolini of Italy invaded Ethiopia, and Italy and Germany entered an alliance known as the Axis powers. In 1936, civil war erupted in Spain, and the Phalangists of Francisco Franco staged a revolt. Franco was supported in this by both Hitler and Mussolini. In 1936, Germany moved into the Rhineland and remilitarized it. Remember, by the terms of Versailles, this was to remain demilitarized, and Germany then disregarded Versailles and Hitler moved in and remilitarized the Rhineland. Also, Versailles had said that Germany was never to merge with Austria, and in 1938, Germany declared an Anschluss with Austria. German soldiers marched into Austria. The Austrians were not exactly fighting them tooth and nail either. This idea of this kind of greater Germany and rebuilding the German people and the German people becoming much more imperialistic was sort of a shared ideal of Austria as well. So again, what Hitler was doing was literally stepping all over the Versailles Treaty, blaming Jews in Germany for Versailles, for the war, for World War I, disregarding the Rhineland, disregarding the merger, the prohibited merger with Austria, moving ahead with an Anschluss. And then in 1938, Hitler wanted the Sudetenland, which was an area of many German-speaking peoples in Czechoslovakia. And if you remember, Czechoslovakia was one of the nations that was founded after World War I by the Versailles Treaty. Now, at the Munich conference, Neville Chamberlain, who was the British Prime Minister, comes back home from that and says that they really have obtained peace in our time. Britain and France were going to allow Hitler to take the Sudetenland, thinking that that would satisfy his desires for extra land, that it would bring peace in their time. And of course, if any words have, been spoken that someone wishes they had never done, Neville Chamberlain was among those, because you couldn't satisfy, you couldn't satiate the insatiable desires of someone like Hitler. This would not result in peace at all. In fact, in 1939, Hitler, not satisfied with just the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia, occupied the remaining areas of Czechoslovakia. And in 1939, the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler. Well, the official kind of beginning of World War II in Europe is September 1st of 1939, when Hitler attacked, that is, he invaded Poland, And Poland, as you recall, was another one of the countries that reemerged after World War I. It had been, from the 1700s on, it had been slowly eaten up by Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and it was divided up really between the three of them and slowly disappeared. And then it had been recreated after World War I at Versailles. But Hitler disregarded this too and attacked, invaded Poland, which did contain, many German speakers and people of German descent. Well, a couple days later, Great Britain and France had had enough, and they in turn declared war on Germany. Germany proceeded to use lightning war, literally in German Blitzkrieg. The Germans defeated Poland in only 4 weeks. And then, as they invaded Poland, the Soviet Union overran other places, 3 places that were also nations formed at Versailles after World War I, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. And then when, after old Finland, of course, which had been around for centuries. Well, in 1940, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of Great Britain. This is going to be very important because he's going to be one of the persons who's going to lead Britain through one of its some of its darkest days. Germany in the same year invaded Denmark and Norway. It swept across the Netherlands and Belgium and finally France. And Italy invaded France from the south. Meanwhile, France fell on June 22nd, 1940. On June 23rd, French General Charles de Gaulle formed a government in exile in London. And the cooperating government of France, led by French General Marshal Pétain, was called the Vichy government of France. It collaborated with Germany. So you basically had 2 governments claiming to be the real government of France. On July 10th of 1940, Germany began the Battle of Britain, where German airplanes attacked military-industrial targets, and by September they were attacking civilian ones, including British cities at night, what was referred to as the Blitz. And this really struck terror into the British people. Well, all of this is happening, and of course, the United States is not involved in the war, except that it is already getting involved in the war even before Pearl Harbor. In 1941, the FDR's administration, the Roosevelt administration, began Lend-Lease. And Lend-Lease literally is what it sounded like. So in other words, we're not going to sell the Allies materials, war materials, but we're going to loan the Allies and lease to the Allies war materials, and after the war they can pay us back. So we were already beginning to support the Allies, like Britain, before we actually declared war against Germany. And of course, Germany does its usual, switch, bait and switch in 1941, and it invaded the Soviet Union, which, was at its ally at one time, right? And this, of course, was like Napoleon's invasion of Russia years before, a mistake. Meanwhile, Nazi submarines began a campaign against American ships. But everything blows up on December 7th of 1941, then when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The next day, the United States declared war on Japan, and on December 11th, Germany and Italy declared war against the U.S., and the U.S. declared war against Germany and Italy. As the U.S. was building up for this great war, this World War II, it had, for a while, a hard time. The Germans were on the move. They were successful until really the tide of war began to turn in favor of the United States and its allies in 1942-43, and in particular in October of 1942, when the first major defeat of the Axis powers occurred at El Alamein in North Africa. Then it was followed by a major German loss at Stalingrad in the Soviet Union in January, February of 1943. So at that time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill met at Casablanca in January 1943 and decided upon an invasion of Sicily in Italy. Subsequent invasions of Sicily and of the entire Italian peninsula occurred until Italy fell in 1944. Then, of course, the U.S. moved towards D-Day, its Allied invasion of France at the beaches of Normandy on June 6 of 1944, involving 4,000 vessels and 1 million men. It was this great attack that will be forever remembered in military history, and certainly in history in general, as this really largest amphibious landing ever. In August, Paris was liberated by the Americans. In December, there was another significant Allied victory at the Battle of the Bulge. This is a little picture of the USS Arizona Memorial at Pearl Harbor. And if any of you have been to Pearl Harbor, it's quite almost a spiritual experience. The USS Arizona is on the bed of Pearl Harbor, and it's still leaking oil. So you can see oil dripping up occasionally. And they left it there and built a memorial over it to all of those who died, Americans at Pearl Harbor. In 1945, at Yalta, FDR, Churchill, and Stalin, because Stalin was now part of the Allies since he had been attacked by Germany, the US, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union agreed that they would each control at the end of the war in Europe their own zones of occupation in Germany, to be determined by the position of their troops at the time when the war would end. And all three agreed to a new organization, namely the United Nations. In 1945, U.S. Marines landed on Iwo Jima, a tiny volcanic island 750 miles from Tokyo. This was the bloodiest battle in the history of the Marine Corps. The U.S. Marines lost over 20,000 men, but they won Iwo Jima, and from that point on, it was a matter of island hopping, towards the Pacific. On April 30th of 1945, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. Things were all but over, and on May 8th of 1945, VE, that is Victory in Europe Day, was declared. Germany surrendered, and by November, the Nuremberg trials of war criminals had begun. By this time, of course, FDR had died, and Harry Truman, the vice president, had become president. He would meet with Allied leaders in 1945 at Potsdam, where they issued an ultimatum demanding that the Japanese surrender by August 3rd or face utter destruction. This is a very interesting portion of American history, as in a very personal thing for me as well. My mother-in-law fled when she was 3 years old, Germany, because her family was of Jewish heritage. They had converted to Christianity a generation or so before, but that didn't matter because Hitler went after anybody of Jewish blood. It didn't matter if you were Jewish 2 generations or more ago, you were Jewish, right? And on the other hand, my father-in-law, who was also Jewish, was one of the great scientists of the 20th century. He was a physicist. He was head later on of the physics department at Stanford University, and he and others, brilliant scientists, worked with Robert Oppenheimer on the Manhattan Project to develop the nuclear bomb. So as I see through, my father-in-law died years and years ago, but as I see through my mother-in-law and father-in-law, all kinds of perspectives on this war, and then through my uncles who were in the war themselves and wounded and served in the European theater and dropped bombs on Germany and were gunners and on B-29s in Europe and served in ships in the Pacific. And the stories from my grandmother and my mother and others of telegrams coming in the middle of the night, and you wondered who was injured. Were they only injured or had they died? And although none of my immediate relatives died from war wounds, although a number were wounded, there was a whole side of my in-laws that died in the camps in Germany. So the whole story of the use of the atomic bomb is a very complicated story. Many Americans were sick and tired of war. Even after the first and second atomic bombs were dropped on, namely Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and even the great number who died, between 80 and 200,000 died just on the atomic bomb at Hiroshima itself, the Japanese still refused to surrender. And so the Japanese were determined, their military was determined, let me correct that, their military was determined to fight on for as long as possible. Perhaps some say the intervention of the emperor, who was largely a puppet throughout most of World War II, perhaps that had some say in finally the Japanese agreeing to unconditional surrender. And the Japanese wanted a conditional surrender, which would mean that we would sit down and determine conditions, and the United States wanted unconditional surrender. That unconditional surrender took place on September 2nd of 1945 aboard the USS Missouri, and the war was ended. J-Day victory with Japan. Now, the Holocaust was a real event and was witnessed by thousands of American and Russian and French and British and other Allied soldiers who freed those Jews and others, homosexuals, gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, etc., who were still incarcerated in the camps at the end of the war. About 7 million died in the Holocaust itself. I've been to Hiroshima, Japan. This is the building, one of the few buildings that survived in this condition. And of course, the Japanese have shored it up and tied it together so that it would remain as a monument and part of their Peace Museum in Hiroshima, Japan. Very well-known people who visit the museum at Hiroshima leave behind quotes, and one of them was by Pope John Paul II. And the Japanese were so impressed with this quote that they inscribed it upon a stone which is at the entrance to the Peace Museum. And the Pope said, "War is the work of man. War is destruction of human life. War is death. To remember the past is to commit oneself to the future. To remember Hiroshima is to abhor nuclear war. To remember Hiroshima is to commit oneself to peace." What about World War II? 60 million soldiers and civilians died. 30 million European refugees after the war. Over nearly 100 million people affected, not including the refugees in Asia. The home front was complex, as you might imagine. There was the concern for espionage, and they said loose lips sink ships. There was fear about spies and sabotage and espionage. This in turn led to the very difficult decision in 1942 for the internment of Japanese Americans, mainly those within the continental U.S. Actually, 2/3 of the 320,000 people of Japanese descent lived in Hawaii. They were pretty well left alone. Others on the continent, including many who were American citizens, were rounded up and sent to relocation camps. Many lost their homes and businesses. The U.S. also instituted a draft already in 1940 when the Congress passed the Selective Service Act to register men for a possible draft. More than 30 million men were registered. Eventually, 16 million American men and women served, and 2/3 of those men were drafted. There was a great need to convert industry to a wartime economy. This was a massive effort. Both large and small companies participated, and the U.S. produced for the war effort 300,000 airplanes, 88,000 tanks, 7,000 ships, 3 million vehicles, billions of bullets, and of course, much more. Women were called to work in factories while the men were at war. By 1945, 18 million women were working outside the home, and Rosie the Riveter became the symbol of the importance of women to the workforce. Rationing was also put into effect in order to provide enough supplies for the troops abroad. So families got ration books, and those ration books literally ration things like gasoline and sugar, etc., that were needed abroad for the war effort. People planted victory gardens in their backyards. They held scrap drives to bring in tin and other metals for manufacturing into armaments. They held air raid drills in cities to prepare for possible attack, including places like Cincinnati and Covington and Newport, where there were blackouts and air raid drills. Now, all of this, some of this you can question, well, how much did victory gardens really help? How much did scrap drives really help? And in the end, part of it was to let everyone feel involved in the war, to let everyone feel that they were doing their part, that they were part of the American spirit. And so we see Norman Rockwell's cover for the Saturday Evening Post from May 29th of 1943, showing a woman worker in the factories. And then you see below Rosie the Riveter's, the World War II poster of "We Can Do It." That is, we women can support the war effort. One of those women was my step-grandmother, Lorraine Meter Tencutty here, who worked at the Crosley Corporation. And later on, I talked to one of the descendants of the nephew of Mr. Crosley, Rusty McClure, who put out a book on Crosley. And this was in Cincinnati. They had WLW radio, they made radios and so forth, but she made parts that were used in a bomb. She didn't even know what she was making because they didn't tell the workers what they were making. Wadsworth Watch Case Company in Dayton, Ohio, across from Cincinnati, was producing shell casings, machine guns, and radio parts during World War II, and all kinds of women were working there, some of which I have photos of here. Schools were collecting scrap. You can imagine these kids at Sacred Heart School were doing their, in Bellevue, Kentucky, were doing their part for the war effort. Looks like they've been collecting everything, including stoves from their neighborhood. And they had air raid drills and blackouts, and one of those is described here in the newspaper from January 30th of 1942. There were also war rationing books. This is how they look, the ration stamps, and so that's how they looked. And so if you have any questions, feel free to email or phone me. I'm always happy to help, and have a great week. Thank you.